Okay, good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of Grovest, welcome to our next webinar, where we're going to discuss the future of 12J. We are lucky to have with us three panelists, each one a specialist in their own field. So I welcome Dino Zuccollo from Westbrook, and who is the chairman of the 12J Association of South Africa. To the panel, welcome Dino. Mansoor Parker, who is a partner at ENS, who is a specialist in Section 12J, and Avi Gordon, who is a fund manager of Sunstone Capital and Decentral Energy. So welcome, guys. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to a constructive discussion and debate about the sunset clause that that is coming, or deemed to be coming upon us in June 21. Just for a little bit of background, is that the 12J industry today is close to 10 billion Rand in investments. Nearly 200 12Js are actually out there in the market, and whole industry has been created in terms of a whole lot of fund managers have been created, employed people. There are administration companies such as Grovest, where we, for example, we ourselves employ 20-odd people. And what is going to happen to the industry? It's thriving. It's a new asset class. The returns have been attractive. It creates jobs, and all these type of things are now in the balance in terms of the sunset clause, which is going to be reviewed in June 21. So let me ask our first panelist, which is Mansoor, to just give us the technical side of legislation as regards 12J. Over to you, Mansoor.
Thank you, Jeff. I will not give the whole overview of 12J. What I'll focus on the sunset clause, what it means and what its impact will be. In doing so, naturally we touch upon the fact that the 12J gives investors an immediate upfront deduction when they subscribe for shares in a venture capital company, which is a company which must be approved by SARS as a venture capital company. And they can claim those deductions up to annual limits of 2.5 million Rand if the investor is an individual, or up to 5 million Rand. The 12J incentive was introduced in 2009. At the time of its introduction, it was subject to a 12-year sunset clause. And the date of its sunset, the sunset date is 30th of June 2021. Now, in public policy and in legislation, a sunset clause is a type of measure that's contained in the statute. And in essence, it provides that the law will cease to have effect after a specific date unless further legislation is passed to extend the law. Now, what the sunset date means in the context of 12J, it does not mean that the entire regime comes to an end by June 2021. What it means is that investors who subscribe for shares in venture capital companies may only claim tax deductions if they do those subscriptions before 30 June 2021. There's nothing that prevents investors from subscribing for shares in venture capital companies after 30 June 2021, except that they will no longer enjoy the benefit of the tax deduction. And that is why the review of this date is so important. At the time of its introduction, it was meant to be a 12-year incentive, but it was inactive pretty much for the first 6 years of its, first 6 to 7 years of its operation. It really only took off from 2016 onwards. When it was initially introduced, you could almost see the tension in the legislation between the incentive-minded drafters who are wishing to give an incentive to stimulate investment into certain sectors of the economy, and the more hawkish tax avoidance element within the legislative drafting circles, who put on many requirements, limitations, exceptions, and made it very unattractive for investors to invest. And we saw limited to no investments for the first 5 to 6 years of the existence of the VCC. Over time, those restrictions were gradually removed. And from 2016 onwards, we showed a surge in venture capital company formations, an increase in subscriptions, and the real growth of this asset class. So when you look at this regime, it hasn't actually been a 12-year incentive. It's been more like a 6-year incentive. And for that reason, I hope that National Treasury, when they consider, as part of their review of the 12-year incentive, that they look at extending the sunset date so that it does not expire on 30 June 2021, but that it extends to a later period, so that we get, in effect, the full 12 years that the incentive was meant to provide benefit to the economy. Thank you, Jeff.
Okay, thanks, Mansoor. So with that in mind, Dino, chairman of the 12J Association, the 12J Association has gone to a lot of work to actually pull a report and do some lobbying in terms of what Section 12J stands for. And you have driven a report. We're going to just give us some background and history and information about the report, please.
Sure, Jeff. Thanks very much for the time and to everyone for dialing in. Maybe to start at the beginning, the 12J Association of South Africa is, as Jeff mentioned, an industry body, which was created, I suppose, with two primary goals in mind. The first is to educate members of the public, government, the media, etc., on the success and activities of the 12J legislation. And the second is to act as a point of contact when it comes to engagements with members of the National Treasury, of Parliament, and of our government. We're very proud to represent about 86% of the total assets under management in the Section 12J industry. And we've been quite active over the last year or two in engaging specifically with National Treasury, with members of Parliament, as Mansoor has nicely positioned, the sunset clause around Section 12J. And I think to give a little bit of background to the report that we've prepared is through multiple engagements, specifically with Parliament and Treasury, the point has been repeated on numerous occasions that much is made in the media and much has been discussed publicly about the attractiveness of the Section 12J deduction, but not much is known about the incentive as regards, where the incentives money has been spent and the success of the incentive in South Africa. And I think that was really, Jeff, the context as to why the 12J Association of South Africa commissioned a survey of our members earlier this year, really with the sunset clause in mind, so as to give government and National Treasury and Parliament more quantifiable, hard information to consider as a part of the assessment of the success of the incentive when they consider the sunset. And that report was published earlier this month, and I think the results speak for themselves. Maybe to give you just a high level of some of the key findings report, which you can view at 12jassociation.co.za. That's 12jassociation.co.za. You can download the report there. But the report's key findings are as follows. I mean, as you mentioned, Jeff, there's been approximately 10 billion rand raised into the incentive. And based on a survey of our members where we asked them the question around, of that 10 billion, how much do they believe to be incremental? In other words, had it not been for the attractiveness of the Section 12J deduction, how much of that money do you think would not have been invested in South Africa on a 5-year lockup basis into SMMEs in the country? And I think the answer there was very interesting, which is that 82% or 7.6 billion rand of the total amount raised in the industry is incremental. For me, that's a hugely positive and enlightening statistic, especially in the context of the fact that a lot of the money raised in 12J companies is from high net worth individuals. And clearly in the current context, a lot of that money is currently being invested offshore. And so really what 12J initially is doing is it's convincing wealthy people to invest locally in South Africa. But aside from that, I think why the report is interesting is because it's then given us more information as to the activities of 12J businesses. And some of the key findings are as follows. Of the roughly 9.3 billion rand that's been raised, approximately 5.5 billion, or about 60% of that money, has been invested across 360 different SMMEs around the country. That's an average investment size of about 15 million rand. And when you consider that about 2 billion of that money has only just been raised now at February, the effective investment rate of the industry is closer to 75%. We can get into it a little bit later, but the key industries of investment include renewable energy, student accommodation and education, hotels and tourism, which is a big theme in Section 12J, technology, fintech, agriculture, and various others. We also had a look at job creation, and perhaps this is as well something that we can delve into. But, you know, based on our members' feedback, we've created about 10,500 jobs with that 5.5 billion rand that's been invested. And if you look at the numbers that Treasury circulates as part of the annual budget as to how much Section 12J has cost the fiscus, and you just extrapolate it to this year, you can work out that those 10,500 jobs have been created at an approximate 126,000 rand per job, which sounds expensive, but it actually compares favorably to other employment incentives out there that our government have put in place, which provide for a cost per job of up to 450,000 rand per job. Also, interestingly, is that SMMEs in South Africa, especially, you know, Mansoor made the point, 12J has not been around for the 12 years that it was intended to be around for. It's been around for much shorter. And so that 10,500 jobs is an impressive figure, but bear in mind that the SMMEs in Section 12J are new, and they still need time to nurture and to mature and to grow. And so what we did as part of the report is we also took the industries of investment and we applied well-known economic multipliers that say, you know, for every 100,000 rand or for every million rand invested into hotels, on average, X number of jobs are created. And if you extrapolate the 9.3 billion rand raised into the industry, we believe that 12J has the ability to create about 45,000 jobs based on the current assets under management in the industry at an average cost per job of 30,000 rand. So a far more appealing and attractive cost per job metric than even the one that we're quoting now. And so I suppose, you know, there were many other findings we can talk through, but the ultimate takeaway from the report is exactly as Mansoor alluded to earlier, which is the initial indications are good. Section 12J has started to make the impact that we thought it could. But we've actually practically only had 5 or 6 years of the initial expected 12 years in the industry. And so really, I think a good base case for our government is to extend for another 6 years, which would give us the 12 years initially anticipated in the legislation. And then we can really make a properly informed decision at that point. Sorry, Jake, you're on mute.
Before we ask Avi to introduce himself, I just want to put it out there to all the guys, our viewers, that to the extent that you have any questions, please use the Q&A button and send through your questions, and then I will direct them to the appropriate person to answer them. And so please feel free to do that. So over to you, Avi. Avi, you are a fund manager, you're running 2 Section 12J venture capital funds, being Sunstone Capital and Decentral Energy. How does the sunset clause or the proposed sunset clause affect you in any way?
So how's it, Jeff? Look, I think there's substantial impact, and I'd like to talk it out maybe a little bit for each of the funds. I think it's quite interesting that they're both positioned quite differently in the market, and hopefully this can actually give a good view on how it will affect 12J as a whole. So I guess the main challenge when you're looking at the sunset clause is the fact that there's literally almost 2 capital raises left. So Section 12J funds need to raise capital. That capital then gets invested into qualifying companies. That's how we do all this job growth, all this economic stimulation. That's where it comes from. So our life force is our capital. And when you bear in mind, I'm going to echo Dino's thoughts that 12J has only been around a couple of years. The fact that we haven't really had a chance to explore and get our capital base as big as it is, being limited with 1 or 2 more capital raises, it's a real challenge. And what it does is it doesn't allow us to grow at the pace we need to. And I mean, just looking at the effect it will have, I mean, Sunstone Capital is a good example. So we invest in rentals, so the rental of assets. Now, obviously, we play in very niche sectors and we provide services to SMEs who would otherwise have trouble getting access to finance. A rental model is not the most lucrative, attractive model, right? So to make an investment case to an objective third party without the tax incentive is very difficult. So a fund with the likes of Sunstone, you know, when packaged in a 12J, it's very attractive. We can help niche market sectors, we can grow things. But if you take that 12J deduction away, it's not as attractive. And I think that touches again on what Dino was talking to, the incremental factor, that these investments otherwise would not have been made. These SMEs otherwise wouldn't have been supported. So I think it's a real challenge for anyone in that space. I mean, that's a good example. The second one would be, let's look at Decentral. It's an energy fund. We invest at a development phase. So what we do is we predominantly focus on commercial and industrial solar. So we'll target a portfolio, REIT, anyone who's out there, and we say, look, we'll go on your roof, we'll install solar kits, we'll provide you with clean energy at a cheaper price. Great service, great value add, massive job stimulus. I mean, at any given point, there's 20, 30 people working on a roof for 6 months long. Really attractive and really nice investment. The challenges associated with it historically are, investor risk appetites. Investors don't generally want to invest at that earlier phase, i.e. at a development level. And while we do our best to obviously put fixed contracts in place, etc., we find ourselves in a unique position where we're able to take that first leap, to put that first set of capital down. Once we roll that out, I mean, the banks knock on your doors the next day. As soon as you've got a solar plant up and running, everyone wants to lend to it. It's attractive. They're locked in prices, good income generation. But the challenge is before, where do you get the finance for it? And banks historically and institutions do not like lending at a development level. And I think Section 12J has changed the game for energy. As Dino mentioned, it's one of the biggest sectors. It's really attractive. It makes a lot of sense. There's a good asset underpin, but it's got infrastructure-related returns, right? So 12, 14% odd, wherever you manage to play in between. So for an individual investor who's looking to make personal decisions with their own investment money, maybe if they want more risk, they'll go elsewhere. If they want more stable, they'll go to a bond. It's not an easy sell, but when you've got an infrastructure-backed investment hitting 20%, they'll then look at something like that. And what that does in turn is really stimulate the economy and really grow it. Now, these funds, we've obviously developed, we've invested them, we've got projects going, but our ability to keep on going into new projects is directly linked to how much capital we can raise. And likely all that would happen is, if the sunset clause are not continued, we'd run our existing portfolio, care and maintenance package. Obviously, investors will get their return, it'll still look great, but there'll be a huge halt in the growth. And I think that's probably the most important part and the most critical knock-on.
Okay, thank you, Avi. So during the course of the chat this afternoon, we're going to do some polls. So Paul, if I can ask you to put the first poll onto the screen, and really it is on a scale of 1 to 5, how well do you think that you understand the sunset clause and its implications? And just so we get some sort of idea of where we are standing of what the poll is. So I'll then keep the poll open for a couple more seconds. Okay, Paul, can we close the poll and just present the results, please? Okay, so it seems that the people do know about the sunset clause. 48% somewhat, 41% very well, and 11% not at all. Anyway, we're going to hopefully ask you that question again at the end of the session, and hopefully we'll see some sort of change in terms of knowledge gathering. Mansoor, just to you, why do you think that Treasury had put in a sunset clause, and for what reason do you think they might close it down, if any? You're on mute, Mansoor. Okay, you're on mute. Okay, there we go.
Thanks for that. At the time of its introduction in 2009, Treasury did say that the purpose of the 12-year period is to provide an opportunity to evaluate the effectiveness of the VCC regime. At that time, they did not state what factors they would take into account to perform that evaluation. However, during this year's budget speech by the Minister of Finance, which is normally accompanied by a very comprehensive budget review document, National Treasury set out about 6 criteria that they would use to evaluate all tax incentives including 12J, but not limited to 12J. And of those 6 factors, they said the first question is, has this now, in last year's budget speech, she performed in the 2019-2020 period. So that review has been undertaken or is currently ongoing. Number 2, does it have a sunset clause? 12J does have a sunset clause, 31 June 2021. Number 3, is the tax incentive in line with current government objectives? Now, this is where the 12J Association report, which Dino has been instrumental in preparing, is very helpful, because it establishes that connection between the desire of using 12J to get equity financing into small and medium-sized businesses due to the historic inaccessibility that they've experienced trying to access this types of equity finance. Number 4, does it support job creation? And again, the stats quoted by Dino were excellent in this regard, but it appears to do so at a very good cost. Number 5, how many taxpayers are claiming the incentive? Treasury is keen on avoiding incentives where there's too few taxpayers who are taking it up. For 12J, there's been a decent spread of taxpayers, and that spread is contained in the budget documents. What they did find is that there were generally very few high net worth individuals who were getting the bulk of the benefits of the 12J deduction. And the response to that was to place a cap on the annual amount of deductions which an investor can claim. So that issue has been dealt with, and there's a fairly decent spread of investors in 12J products. The final question, does the provision of the tax incentive create unintended consequences or distortions? Now, this is an issue where Treasury had mentioned some disquiet, where they said it was not being operated in the manner that they had intended. And we saw a number of amendments coming through in 2018 and 2019 to deal with those issues. So with those amendments, I think the responses to these 6 questions should be quite positive.
Okay, thank you, Mansoor. Dino, what would you say is next steps in terms of engaging with Treasury and to interact with them, and how do we as industry get heard and voice our concerns and lobby change?
Well, Jeff, it's all the question at the moment. So we're at that time of year where every year annually around this time, this week last year, National Treasury released the TLAB, or the Taxation Laws Amendment Bill, in draft form. And that TLAB typically creates or gives you the information regarding the set of changes that National Treasury propose making in respect of the next legislative cycle. And we've been in this world in 12J for 2 years now, where Treasury have made amendments to the law in both years. And there's a very well-established process that happens thereafter. It's very difficult to engage with National Treasury and or Parliament in the Standing and Select Committees of Finance in Parliament until such time as the TLAB document is released. They tend to be very tight-lipped, and they aren't too keen on talking to industry and external participants until such time as that doc has come out. I suppose a couple of questions stem from that. The first is, to what degree the timing will differ this year as regards the release of the TLAB as a consequence of COVID-19. But once the document has come out, Jeff, the process is typically one of engagement with National Treasury initially. National Treasury typically take responses on the draft bill with a set deadline. And thereafter, they will follow a process of engaging with the various participants in industry to the degree that there are material amounts of concerns around a particular change. If National Treasury don't like the responses received or choose to ignore them, then the next level that you would talk to would be Parliament. First, the Standing and then the Select Committees of Finance in Parliament. But really, once you've reached that stage, it's very irregular that changes are made against what Treasury have recommended. So I think what really is all eyes at the moment in the industry is to see the release of the TLAB and to ask 2 questions. First of all, is there going to be a review of Section 12J in the lab? Or perhaps will Treasury leave it to next year? based on our engagements with Treasury, they have reconfirmed that it was their intention a couple months ago to look at 12J in this current legislative cycle. So we are expecting to hear something in that document. And thereafter, depending on what that something is, we would need to follow the various channels of communication. I think it is relevant, Jeff, to say that, you know, there are very differing views in Treasury and Parliament around Section 12J, depending on who you talk to. There are members of who are quite negative to the legislation, and they will cite abuse as being their major concerns. There are others who are supportive of 12J, and then there's also a camp that just doesn't like incentives and see them as being against what the intentions of a good tax system should be. And so it's going to be very interesting to see in the coming weeks what the next steps are.
Okay, thanks, Dino. Avi, I mean, Dino mentioned something about COVID. How do you think, as a fund manager, that COVID-19 will play any, let's say, have any weighting when it comes to making a decision as whether to extend the 12J regime or not?
Sure, it's a loaded question, Jeff, but a good one. I think there's a number of elements we need to look at. I think one, we need to look at the practicality of the financial situation, the economy around us. Question one is the economy able to sustain itself, i.e., can it attract foreign investment, can it attract local investment in the state that it is, or do we require these incentives to keep motivating it? I think that's point one. Point two is, I think there will be a slowdown from all institutions, and I think even from Section 12J funds. You know, there's going to be a lot more caution applied when it comes to what investments are made, what risk is acceptable, how do we manage it, and again, I think post, and maybe I'm a believer because I'm a 12J fund manager, I see what we do, I've read the report, I understand the impact we have on the economy. I think it's absolutely critical. Whether or not everyone will see it that way, I can't comment, but I can say this: to stimulate growth in an economy which is struggling, critical. And to cut off one of the legs, and I think 12J has become a big leg. I think for any entrepreneur, SME out there, if they can find some way to tap into this 12J funding, they do. And I think to take that away from an economy, I don't think it's intelligent. I think it puts more additional strain on a system which is already struggling. So yeah, post section 12J, post June next year, I think we need to see an extension.
Okay, Paul, thank you, Avi. Paul, can we put on the next poll? Just to get an understanding of our audience is, have they invested or have you invested in a Section 12J previously? Simple yes or no. And so we can get some sort of idea of the audience that we are talking to. I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to ask our panelists if we can keep I have a lot of questions coming through from the audience, and I'm going to give it to them, but I'm going to ask you to keep your questions pretty brief, or not brief, but briefer, so we can get through all the various questions. Paul, will you close the poll, please, and give us the results? Okay, so quite interesting, albeit that most people on this call know a lot or somewhat a lot on the sunset clause. Only 36% have invested into 12J, which means that there's potentially a whole lot of investors currently on this call who may want to still invest before the sunset clause. Okay, very interesting poll. Okay, thank you, Paul. All right, so Dino, this is also a question from one of the viewers, but it's also something that I think that I'd like to pose to you, is that hospitality is probably one of the biggest sectors in which Section 12J investors have committed to. Obviously, also that it is probably the largest creative jobs out of all Section 12J initiatives. It has been hit terribly by COVID. Other than the one investment that I know which is the Pepper Club Hotel, where there's a guaranteed yield. I think all other 12Js are taking a lot of strain. Tell me, what is your view on the hospitality Section 12J and maybe even the sunset clause?
Jeff, you asked me for a short answer, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to give you one to that question. So let's start with this. You're right. Hospitality is the single biggest industry of J investment to date. There's been about 2 billion rand invested into hotels. It's a very topical debate because for those of you who aren't familiar with the 12J legislation in that much detail, you can't invest effectively into fixed property in Section 12J unless you are a hotel keeper as defined. And that was done very specifically by government because of exactly Jack's point, which is that hotels are one of the best jobs creators in the country. However, I suppose the issue and the contention has come from National Treasury that whilst they understood the desire to invest, or for the industry to invest in hotels, they're also of the view that that is where a lot of the historic abuse has come from. And, you know, we must give credit where credit's due. I believe that some of the more recent changes to the 12J legislation, especially in 2018, was very successful in removing that abuse. And for the viewers' benefit, you know, the definition of a hotel is quite wide. And so what we started to see happening in the industry was people calling their holiday homes hotels, and people calling all sorts of properties hotels that in fact weren't, and then claiming tax deductions for doing so. And that was done through a very particular structuring mechanism in the law that Treasury removed the ability to do in 2018. The other point on hotels that Treasury raise a lot is that they're not sure whether in their minds investment specifically into a hotel results in an incremental investment flow. In other words, they're not convinced that specifically with hotels, had it not been for 12J, the money wouldn't have just been invested there anyway, if that makes sense. And there have been very flippant comments made in Parliament around that. Other banks would just give the money and so on and so forth. So I think it certainly is probably the area where there's the biggest pushback from a regulatory perspective. Admittedly, in the past, it was the area where there was abuse. My view around it, you know, you got to go where investors want to go, and clearly the market has spoken, which is that a property-backed nature of an underlying investment is one that's attractive to investors, and it's been very successful in raising and investing money. So I think there's definitely two sides to the coin. I think the abuse element is gone. I don't think it's necessary to have swayed Treasury, and my personal opinion is that if we do see an extension of Section 12J, we might not see an extension of specifically the hotel keeping carve out, but it would certainly not be the right decision from my perspective.
Okay, so, you know, I know I've sat in meetings with Treasury, and I understand they don't like hospitality, which I think is extremely short-sighted for a lot of the reasons that you've raised. We also know that traditional banks don't like hotels very much, because they got burned through all the golf course schemes at one stage. That was the full rage, and I think they've still got a short memory. But I mean, in reality, what South Africa actually needs is creating employment, and also the downstream jobs that are created from hospitality. I mean, also very close to my heart is hospitality. So I speak with authorities that it constitutes 8.7% of the GDP of South Africa. It's our second greatest export that we have in the country. So I think that the more hospitality that we can actually promote and get assistance from Treasury, I think it would really, really be a pity should they actually exclude it.
Look, and Jeff, the one thing we haven't touched on is the degree to which hotels in particular have been decimated by COVID-19. And so arguably, had there been an industry that needed 12J right now, it would be hotels.
Yeah, absolutely. And it needs additional input of working capital and new funding, so to get them through this hump, which is more than ever. So very, very much needed.
Hmm.
Mansoor, just, you know, there's a, if the sunset clause comes into play, there would be, in terms of the 12J rules, which is quite complex, with albeit a small piece of legislation, got lots of nooks and crannies, and you really need to be an expert to navigate yourself across that legislation. What constraints would there be to, let's say, Section 12J fund managers currently in play?
If you are correct, like most pieces of legislation, the difficulty with 12J lies in all the requirements, exceptions, conditions, provisos that exist within the provisions. I think one of the difficulties that will exist is that we're about a year to go until the sunset date. A rule was introduced that there'd be a grace period for capital raising, that where CCs raise capital from investors, and if a larger investor comes in initially, they have about 2 years to do further capital raises in order to get all the investors below this 20% number, which is the safe harbor number. We don't want to exceed 20% in a venture capital company. Now, with the short period of time that we have to do capital raising, with recently formed funds, if they have very few large investors, they don't have that much time to do further capital raises. And that becomes a really big risk for them. So although they might have a grace period to raise capital, the question would become that if they're investing in high risk assets where the tax incentive makes it attractive to invest in that in those assets, what's the likelihood of them continuing to attract capital investment after the sunset date, particularly if they've got a few larger investors in the fund? So that becomes a real issue. So with the extension of the grace period that goes beyond 2021, what we should at least see is the extension of the sunset date, so that it matches, at least, at the very least, the grace period that funds have to do additional capital raising. Because it doesn't make sense to tell funds you have until dates in the future to raise capital, but the incentive expires next year. So I think that would be the key. The key issue for funds would be the capital raising to get their numbers below the 20% threshold.
Thanks, Mansoor. So Dino, going back to you, I mean, Mansoor makes a very valid point in terms of matching and timing. How much detail was this covered in the report?
Jeff, I think what we looked at quite extensively was the timing of the investment from the capital raised into the underlying businesses. And for me, it's something that was very important because Treasury have made the comments time and time again that they're unhappy with the slow, what they call deployment rates in the industry. And I think that for us was the biggest focus in the survey, was to understand if that's in fact true. And, you know, 60% of the money that has been raised has been invested. And if you take out the fact that 2 billion had been raised already, or not already, sorry, 2 billion had been raised at February already, could not reasonably have been invested in the current COVID world. About 75% of the money that's been invested in 12J has been spent. And so, I mean, my view on this is that what 12J actually is it's a clever way of co-opting the private sector to go and make good investments on government's behalf. And instead of government collecting the money and reinvesting the money itself, it's getting, you know, private sector to do that and giving the benefit directly to the ultimate 12J investor, and really within the timeframes required. And those timeframes are 4 years per the law, but from what we can see, the investment rates on average are much quicker.
Okay, great. So Avi, also relating to a question is, I mean, what backup plan would you as a fund manager have should sunset clause be coming to play to raise additional capital? if any? And even a suggestion was made, would you consider ICO, initial coin offering? You know, so I'm trying to kill two birds with one stone here.
So look, Jeff, again, I think it would differ from fund to fund. You know, again, if I look at the likes of a Decentral, it's an attractive space. There's a big market out there. We could look at investment outside of Section 12J, but I think the fund point, as mentioned before, we take on the debt and we grow the base and press those assets as much as we could, and then there would almost be a care and maintenance package. You know, for the likes of a Sunstone, which is really a conservative yield, we'd manage the current book, get our returns to our investors, but I don't think we'd look aggressively to grow outwardly. And, you know, obviously as opportunities arise, an RCO, something along those lines, it is worth exploring, but you've always got to be cognizant of yield, risk, and return. And ultimately, we want to make sure we're taking care of our investors first. So as a fund manager, my view would be make sure we protect current funds that have been invested, maximize yield for investors, and look to slowly exit investors as their exit periods come to an end. But I think to look aggressively for new creative ways would be important, would be a part of what we look for, but not first priority. First priority there is maximize what we have.
Okay, thank you. Paul, can we put on another poll just to get some sort of idea, a feel again of what everyone has, you know, what they're thinking. So to date, we've still got 15 odd minutes to discuss. So just you out there in the viewers, do you think that the sunset clause will be extended? What is your personal view? Yes or no? So it'll be quite interesting to get some sort of idea of what you've heard so far. Okay, Paul, thank you. If you can take down the poll and give us the results. Okay, so that's extremely positive. 69% says yes, 31% says no. We as a panelist are not allowed to vote, but if I had to stick my, you know, neck out, I'm voting yes. It'll be interesting from our panelists. Mansoor, what do you think?
I think yes as well. I think that the cost to the fiscus has been very low. Each year when they produce the list of tax expenditures, the 12J incentive does not cost a lot to the fiscus. And what I like about the 12J report is that it shows that the upfront cost of the tax deduction has to be seen against the fact that they do claw back the capital gains tax on exit. And when the equity financing goes into the qualifying company, there's corporate income tax generated there, there's VAT generated, there's employees tax generated. So on a total tax basis, I'm pretty sure that the regime works out to be quite attractive for the fiscus. At the moment, that emphasis is on the top line upfront immediate tax deduction number. It should really be compared against the total tax take arising from that initial investment.
Thank you. Dino, just, I'm not going to hold you to it, but what do you think, yes or no?
Jeff, I think Mansoor's touched on a very important point. And you know, a lot of people have asked this question, does COVID-19 make your chances of extension better or does it make it worse? And I think there's arguments on both sides. I mean, you know, to take Mansoor's point further, in the UK, who have an equivalent of 12J called the Venture Capital Trust or VCT rules, in any given year, they generate more tax through that legislation than they give as deductions. So they've created a very clever SMME-focused investment ecosystem that pays for itself. Now, if our government were to take that view, in my mind, it's a no-brainer, especially in the context of the fact that we've clamped down on abuse. However, you know, COVID also does result in our fiscus having one of the largest, I think it might be the largest fiscal deficit we've ever had. And if the view is we need money and we need money now, and we can't wait for 3 or 4 years' time for the investments to start yielding returns, then we may see a less favorable response. My thoughts are we probably will see an extension, but we will see a revision in the industries into which the incentive is allowed to invest.
Okay, just quite interesting that when you compare South Africans' VCC rules to that of the UK VCT rules, the VCT rules has a cap of, you only get a maximum 30% deduction, wherein in South Africa as an individual, you can get up to 45%. So, you know, just at the outset, the South African rules are much more generous than that of the VC2, which is it's a positive for the industry. Avi, what's your view on whether the sunset clause will be extended or not?
Listen, I think first of all, we have a much better chance now when I look at the publication issued by the 12J Association. I think there's been an excellent job of really highlighting the benefits and the substantial progress made within Section 12J, touching on all these points, the reduction of the abuse, the expenditure of capital, the growth, the investment. So I think there's a strong case there. And I mean, if you just look at it on a high level, if you look at the types of vehicles we've created, I mean, take the energy fund, we've got 20-year-long assets that we've created, which means we've got corporate taxpayers for the next 20 years. South Africa's corporate taxpayer base is among the lowest in the world. I think it oscillates around 6%. Mansoor, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that means our SMEs contribute about 6% to our corporate taxes, and that's awful and frightening. And South Africa really needs stimulation at that bottom level, and that's what 12J does. So I think again, the beauty's in the eye of the beholder. How they're going to approach, how they're going to understand our report, but if you look at it on an objective basis, it just makes so much sense.
Okay, thank you. So. Dino, I've had a question from one of the viewers, and they say, do you think that Treasury looks upon investments in schools in a 12J as the same as they do as on hospitality?
So I don't know the answer, Jeff, to be honest with you. I think what I can say is that 12Js is somewhat political, and I think it's important for our government that the businesses that are being invested into are startup, are generating a lot of jobs, are in the right areas, and so on. I think what I've seen is it's not so much a question of the types of industries, Jeff, so much as it is the principles. And those principles for me are, is the money incremental? That's the number one question, right? Are government giving a tax incentive just because? In other words, you know, are they giving an incentive because, or for money that would otherwise have been invested in the same place anyway? Or are they genuinely changing behavior as a consequence of the incentive? That's question number one. And then question number two comes to, you know, what are the locations of the investments? How many jobs have been created? What are the types of the industries and so on? It's not just hotels, it's schools, it's student accommodation, and so on and so forth. I don't think there's any question that the industries of 12J investments are positive for South Africa. You know, from an energy business where we've got Eskom at the moment, to a student accommodation business where we've got one of the biggest shortages in the world, to agriculture and so on. I think the industries are clearly industries in this country that need investment. What is less clear is whether or not the money is incremental, and hopefully the report has gone some way to demonstrate that, and how many jobs have been created, and again, hopefully it's gone some way to demonstrate that.
Mansoor, a question from one of our viewers is, in terms of abuse, what do you think that Treasury is trying to close down? In what type of abuse is Treasury trying to avoid, if any?
I think if we look at the amendments that they put through in 2018, it actually covers the areas of concern to them. And they're quite technical, the amendments. But I think what might have happened is that in Treasury's view, they saw 12J as consisting of a bunch of passive investors and an active fund manager. And we would put our cash into the VCC, and the fund manager would source the investments, and we'd have meetings twice a year or to report back on the progress of those investments. But what we found is that there's been a group of very activist investors who, instead of leaving it to the fund manager to identify opportunities, said, well, I think here's an opportunity in which I'd like to get involved. Can I access that through the VCC because it's something new, it's something early stage. There's no guarantee of success, doesn't have a very long history. And this marriage of actively involved investors with slightly more passive fund managers, which I think upset Treasury because they were looking for a different kind of model where the investors are more retail-based investors who are coming in. And if we look at many of the amendments that were made, it was done to break the link between the investor and the underlying qualifying company. That the investor cannot be too involved in the underlying qualifying company. So I think that was broadly the essence. In the most recent round of amendments, they were concerned that too many high net worth individuals were getting too much of the benefits of 12J, and they doubted that by means of the cap. What's also interesting is if you look just at the content of our 12J VCC compared to the UK VCT, their regime runs into different chapters. It's very detailed legislation. They make provision for their VCT to issue different classes of shares. So you can subscribe for a share where you get a deduction, and you can subscribe for a share where there's no tax deduction, and they have different attributes attaching to them. You can see that's a regime that's been in existence for a longer period of time and has developed and evolved. Ours is still at a very early stage, consists of very few provisions, and it therefore leaves a lot unsaid. And therefore, when different people read it, there's different views on what the regime can achieve. And between regulators such as SARS and Treasury and taxpayer, there's always this mismatch in expectations of what the section allows one to do. We almost see the same thing in a contract where if I need to make the payment and you need to receive the payment, I interpret my payment obligation very narrowly. So I think I only have to pay you in very narrow circumstances, whereas you interpret it very widely, and it's the exact same clause. And we see this coming through in legislation. I think what 12J would benefit from is just the gradual deepening of the rules so that the landscape gets made clear, and we don't have this divergent approaches where taxpayers think that they're entitled to take a certain step, and then Treasury thinks that that step is an abuse of the provisions in the legislation. Yeah, so by and large, I think it was largely a expectations about the role of the investors versus the fund managers setting up the VCCs.
Thank you, Mr. Another question I have was that the compliance and legislation in Section 12J, is there, is it open to abuse? And, I would like to answer that, if you don't mind, is that Grovest, as a fund administrator, looks after plus minus 40 Section 12J funds as an administrator, where it does all the back end type of work, whether it's reporting to the FSCA or SARS, working with the compliance officers, the key individuals, accounting, auditors, the company secretaries, etc., etc. And I can actually say, hand on heart, that I'm very, very impressed with the corporate governance that is taking place in Section 12Js. Is that you have to report to SARS twice a year, you have to report to FSCA minimum once a year. There's compliance officers that have to sign off on various reports. The key individual is on the line, and he has to be a responsible person to see that the liquidity and solvency of the business is always there, and that things are run accordingly. Most of these companies are public unlisted companies, and so therefore all subscribing to King Code of Conduct, King 4, which requires a whole lot of governance and reporting to the fact where one doesn't comply. So I would not saying that there aren't any bad eggs, and I would say that there possibly will be bad eggs in any environment. But speaking from Grovest, I'm very confident and comfortable with the legislation and compliance that is taking place in the industry. Guys, we've just got a few more minutes, so I'm going to, and I apologize to the guys whose questions we haven't got to, but it's been very, very interesting. So the bottom line is that I would just like, you guys to have a close off, and I'm going to give you each of you guys 1 or 2 minutes just to give your last thoughts on the sunset clause, and I'll take the opportunity to just say thank you very much to the viewers for their attendance. I think, Paul, can we have the last poll, just so we can just get some sort of idea if the guys have learnt anything, and it's much appreciated. So let's start with you, Mansoor. Won't you give your sign off?
Sure. I think the VCC regime it's a well-targeted incentive, and I agree with Dino. What they might very well be is more focus on industries. Treasury might very well think that certain industries which have benefited from 12J no longer needs that benefit in future, and then they might describe the industries to benefit differently. But I see that as the evolution of 12. I hope that it stays in. I think it is a benefit. I think it provides something for the qualifying companies, something for the investors, something for SARS. I think it's a good incentive. It should stay.
Thank you. Dino?
Yeah, I think 12J it's going to become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy in my view. I think when Treasury included 12J in the law, they wanted to experiment, and they wanted to try and see whether this type of legislation could help SMMEs and jobs in South Africa. As a consequence of issues with the law, that incentive took 6-7 years to take off. And we're at a point in the development of 12J where we're now starting to take off. But, again, we're investing as an industry into SMMEs, small businesses that take a lot of time to grow and incubate and get larger. And I think we're right on the precipice. The view is that I say it will be a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that, if Treasury shut it down now, it probably will be concluded that it wasn't successful because you shut it down too soon. If it was given time, and if it was given the ability to grow and to metamorphosize and to be further refined as it has in the UK, it will create, in my view, a successful SMME-focused investment ecosystem where wealthy individuals who are entrepreneurs and successful business people in their own rights come in, invest into, mentor, and help small businesses grow in the country on a basis which doesn't cost Treasury a lot of money. I think the other thing is that, Treasury need to maybe also articulate what they wanted out of 12J. What is their ultimate metric of success? Is it SMMEs that are created and developed? Is it how many jobs are created? If it's based on jobs created, I don't really understand why there's a cap, because whether 10 million rand comes from 1 people or 10 people, the same amount of jobs are created on the other end. So I think we need to maybe better understand what the legislation is there to do. And we're happy with Treasury and with Parliament and with government to do that. But we need more time, and given more time, it will be a successful incentive.
Thanks, Dino. Avi, to you.
Look, I think, again, echoing what's been said before, but there's been real participation from the whole industry. 12J, over the last couple of years, we've really cleaned up our act. So I think some of the cowboys were put to bed, some of the ill behaviors have stopped, and everyone is really around at this point in time. I'm just seeing that all the other fund managers are engaged with and understand their businesses and what they're doing, and there's really awesome stuff happening, and I think it has to carry on. And I think the same goes our investees. I think people, businesses, SMEs in South Africa are becoming more aware of how to benefit from the other side of this tax benefit, and I think that's growing. And again, to echo Dino's thoughts, like we're about to take off. I think the sophistication over the last 5 years in terms of how we operate, what we do, where we add value, how we grow in the economy, it's been exponential and unbelievable to be a part of. So I think there's all that value. And I guess the only other note is that I think the insecurity is very harmful for a growth environment. And when you look at legislation, you look at government, and you look at SARS, and you look at the way we've responded as an industry, we're desperate to work together. We're excited we're forthcoming with information. No one's trying to hide anything, but I think the industry is begging and saying, just no more surprises. Let's engage regularly. Let's understand each other. Let's work together. And let's do it in a way that it's sustainable and it grows the whole country. And the whole regime will be a success. But again, if they cut it off too early, as Dino said, self-fulfilling prophecy. Those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Dino. Paul, will you just publish the last poll just before we close down? Okay, so a lot more people are now more skilled, and very few do not know what's going on in. So thank you, Paul. So to our panelists, Mansoor, Dino, Avi, thanks for taking the time out. Much appreciated. To our viewers, thank you for joining us. Much appreciated. I hope you learned. I think it was a very, very constructive. I think it was for me, it was a great session. So thanks to all, and look forward to you joining us to further webinars. And should you have any questions, please reach out to us and hopefully we can assist. Okay, so thank you guys and thanks for joining. Okay, be safe and take care.
Thanks.